John, Margaret, Daniel, Michael, and Emily Hartman, the perfect family living in a quiet Ohio town, were about to become the victims of a nightmare no one could have imagined. One cold autumn night, everything they knew about safety and trust shattered forever, plunging Millfield into the darkest tragedy in its history. What happened inside their home that night would leave a mark on the community and reveal secrets no one saw coming. On a chilly autumn evening in 1987, the small town of Millfield, Ohio, was settling into its usual calm. The streets were quiet, leaves rustling gently in the wind, and most of the town's residents were winding down for the night. But inside the Hartman family home, something dark was unfolding. Something that would shake the town to its core and mark a tragic chapter in Ohio's history. The Hartmans were known as a respectable family, the kind neighbors everyone trusted. John Hartman, the father, worked as a local mechanic, while Margaret, his wife, managed the household and cared deeply for their 3 children, Daniel, Michael, and Emily. To outsiders, their life seemed ordinary, even peaceful. Yet that night, silence filled their house in a way that was unnerving. Neighbors who usually heard laughter or the sound of children playing noticed nothing at all. No lights flickered behind the curtains. No car left the driveway. Concerned, a neighbor called the police the following morning when the Hartmans failed to show up for an important community event. Officers arrived at the modest 2-story home on Maple Street, expecting maybe to check on a sick family member or deliver a message. Instead, they were met with a scene so horrific that it seemed impossible to believe. The front door was unlocked, but there were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, nothing to suggest a burglary gone wrong. What awaited inside was far worse. In the living room, 5 bodies lay motionless: John, Margaret, and their 3 children. Each one showed signs of brutal violence. The wounds were severe and clearly inflicted with rage and precision. Blood stained the walls and floor, the air thick with a coppery scent that made the officers' stomachs turn. Among the chaos was a chilling and cryptic detail, a strange symbol drawn in blood on the living room wall. Its meaning was unknown, its presence unexplained. The community was stunned. How could such a tragedy happen here, in their peaceful town? Who could commit such a violent act against a family that seemed so ordinary, so well liked? The questions overwhelmed everyone, and the police faced the daunting task of piecing together what had occurred in those final deadly hours. Neighbors recalled small oddities in the weeks leading up to the massacre: a heated argument overheard late at night, the sound of a car speeding away, a stranger seen lurking near the house. But none of these memories provided clear answers. The Hartman family had no known enemies, no history of violence, no apparent reason for anyone to harm them so mercilessly. As the investigation began, officers combed through the home searching for clues. They collected fingerprints, examined every room for evidence, and interviewed anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual. The case quickly grew complicated. No murder weapon was found, and no clear motive presented itself. The killer had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the brutal scene and the mysterious symbol. The town was gripped by fear and sorrow. Friends and relatives mourned the loss of a family taken too soon. Rumors swirled, theories spread, and the nightmare of that night lingered in the minds of everyone who knew the Hartmans. It was a dark day in Ohio's history, one that marked the beginning of a long and haunting investigation into the worst family massacre the state had ever seen. As the initial shock of the Hartman family massacre began to settle, investigators dug deeper into the lives hidden behind the closed doors of that modest house. What seemed like a perfect family on the surface slowly began to unravel. revealing a tangled web of secrets and conflicts no one in the town had suspected. The quiet town of Millfield was forced to confront the truth that even the closest families can hide dark and troubling realities. John and Margaret Hartman had built a reputation as hard-working and caring parents, but those who knew them well hinted at tensions simmering just beneath the surface. John, a skilled mechanic, often worked long hours and was known to be strict with his children. Margaret, while loving, was described by some as distant and secretive. The three children, Daniel, Michael, and Emily, each seemed to carry their own burdens that had never been visible to outsiders. Daniel, the eldest son, was 22 and had recently dropped out of college. Some neighbors whispered that he had fallen in with the wrong crowd, people involved in petty crime and dangerous activities. There were rumors he owed money to unsavory characters, and that he had grown increasingly withdrawn in the weeks before the massacre. Police found evidence suggesting Daniel might have been involved in something much darker than anyone had guessed, but the details remained murky. Michael, the middle child, was just 17. Unlike Daniel, he kept to himself and was seen as quiet and sensitive, but even he was not immune to the pressures within the family. Friends mentioned that Michael had clashed often with his older brother and seemed burdened by something he never fully explained. Some reports indicated that Michael was struggling with his mental health, though no one had realized how serious it was until it was too late. Emily, the youngest at 14, was a bright girl with a talent for writing. However, when police searched her room, they discovered journals filled with disturbing entries, dark thoughts, strange symbols, and fears that something terrible was coming. Her writings hinted at a troubled mind trying to make sense of a world that felt unsafe and frightening. The mystery of the blood symbol on the wall now took on a new layer of meaning, as investigators wondered if Emily had some connection to it. Margaret's past was also a subject of interest. Before marrying John, she had lived in a different town and had a history that she had never shared with her new community. Some distant relatives revealed that she had been involved in a series of complicated relationships and had left behind more than one secret. This raised questions about whether her past might have caught up with her family in a deadly way. As the police pieced together these fragments, it became clear the massacre was not the result of a random break-in or an external attack. The violence felt deeply personal, rooted in the hidden tensions and secrets that had been building for years inside the Hartman household. But who among them had reached the breaking point? And what dark force had finally exploded into the nightmare that ended their lives? The community's image of the Hartmans was shattered. What was once a family admired and trusted now became the center of suspicion and fear. Every detail revealed more questions than answers, and the investigation grew more complex. The nightmare that started that cold autumn night was far from over. It was only just beginning to expose the painful truth about a family that had appeared perfect, but was hiding devastating fractures within. The discovery of the strange symbol drawn in blood on the living room wall haunted the investigation like a ghost no one could catch. It was a cryptic image, curved lines intertwined with sharp angles, that seemed almost ritualistic, but made no sense to the officers or the experts they consulted. No one in Millfield or the surrounding areas recognized it, and it wasn't linked to any known gangs, cults, or local groups. This baffling clue only deepened the mystery and cast a shadow over the entire case. As days turned into weeks, the police continued their search for answers, but the symbol remained a puzzle. The initial rush of leads and tips from the public began to dry up, and without a clear motive or suspect, the case started to grow cold. The massacre became one of those haunting stories that townspeople whispered about but didn't openly discuss. Too painful, too terrifying to confront directly. Investigators scoured the Hartman home again and again, hoping the symbol might connect to something they had missed. They sent photographs to experts in symbology, anthropology, and psychology, but no one could offer a definitive interpretation. Some suggested it was meant to intimidate. Others thought it might be a twisted message from the killer, but nothing concrete emerged. The symbol remained a cruel enigma painted in blood. Meanwhile, the police hit frustrating dead ends in their search for the killer. There was no murder weapon, no fingerprints other than the family's, and no signs of forced entry. The Hartman family's own history and relationships became the focus, but even there, no single person stood out as a clear suspect. Friends and acquaintances came forward with bits of information, arguments overheard, strange phone calls, and sightings of unfamiliar faces near the house. But none of these clues led to a breakthrough. The case, once the headline of every local newspaper, slowly slipped from public attention. The town tried to move on, but the unanswered questions lingered like a dark cloud. The massacre became a cautionary tale, a reminder that sometimes evil could strike without warning and leave no easy answers behind. Years passed. New generations grew up hearing only whispers of the tragedy. The symbol on the wall became a local legend, something that teenagers dared each other to look for in abandoned houses, a chilling reminder of the worst crime Millfield had ever known. Then, nearly a decade later, something unexpected happened. A retired detective who had worked on the case in its early days decided to review the files one last time. With fresh eyes and the benefit of new forensic technology, he noticed inconsistencies in the original timeline of events. Small details that had been overlooked or dismissed began to fit together in new ways. This detective's findings suggested the massacre was not the chaotic, random attack it had seemed. Instead, the evidence pointed to a carefully planned crime, one that had been staged to confuse investigators. The strange symbol, once thought to be a clue left by an outsider, was likely a deliberate misdirection, meant to throw suspicion far away from the real killer. This revelation reignited the investigation and opened the door to a new line of inquiry, one that focused on the people closest to the Hartman family. The chilling thought settled in. The worst family massacre in Ohio's history might have been an inside job all along. The mystery was far from over, and the town braced itself for the dark truth still waiting to be uncovered. Years after the brutal Hartman massacre, the case had long been forgotten by many, filed away as one of those unsolved tragedies that leave more questions than answers. But for retired detective Frank Collins, the story never truly ended. Having spent months investigating the crime in 1987, he always felt something was missed, some detail overlooked. Now, with years of experience behind him and advances in forensic science, Collins returned to the old case files, hoping to shed new light on the nightmare that had consumed Millfield. He started by meticulously reviewing the timeline of events from that fateful night. The original police reports described the scene and the discovery of the victims, but some accounts didn't add up. For example, witnesses reported hearing a car speed away late at night, but the timeline suggested the family had already been attacked hours earlier. Small details like this caught Collins's attention. He wondered if the time of the massacre had been wrongly recorded, which could mean the killer's movements were misunderstood. Collins also re-examined the symbol painted in blood on the wall. With the help of experts in cryptography and psychological profiling, he considered the possibility it was staged, a false lead meant to confuse investigators. If so, it implied the killer was not only violent, but calculating, someone who wanted to misdirect the investigation away from themselves. New forensic techniques unavailable in the late 1980s were applied to evidence collected from the house. DNA testing, for example, was now more advanced, and investigators could detect traces of skin cells or hair fibers that had gone unnoticed. Surprisingly, samples from under the victim's fingernails didn't match any outsider. Instead, some traces suggested a member of the household had been involved in a violent struggle. This discovery pushed the investigation toward a disturbing conclusion. The massacre was most likely an inside job. Collins turned his focus to the family members. The long-simmering conflicts within the Hartman household suddenly gained new significance. The arguments between Daniel and Michael, the hidden pressures on Margaret, and Emily's disturbing writings all hinted at deep family fractures. But the greatest mystery was Michael himself, the youngest son who had vanished shortly after the massacre and was presumed dead by many. His disappearance was never fully explained, and his absence now seemed suspicious. With the renewed investigation, law enforcement agencies launched a search for Michael. Years of false leads and dead ends had obscured his trail, but new technology and cooperation between states made it possible to track him down. To everyone's shock, Michael was found living under a different name in a distant town, struggling with mental health issues and haunted by the past. Michael's capture reopened the wounds of the massacre for Millfield. His eventual confession revealed a dark story of jealousy, greed, and desperation within the family. An inheritance dispute had escalated into violence. Feeling betrayed and powerless, Michael had planned the attack to eliminate those standing between him and control of the family's assets. The symbolic blood marking was his attempt to mask the truth, a diversion crafted in panic and rage. Detective Collins's determination to revisit the case had brought long-awaited answers. The massacre was no longer a cold mystery, but a story of betrayal from within. Though justice finally caught up with Michael, the scars left on the community and the memory of the Hartman family would linger forever, a haunting reminder of how darkness can grow in the most unexpected places. Michael Hartman's discovery sent shockwaves through Millfield and beyond. For years, he had been presumed dead or vanished without a trace, a ghost lost in the aftermath of the massacre. But now, living under a new identity in a small town hundreds of miles away, his fragile mental state made him both a key to unlocking the mystery and a tragic figure weighed down by guilt and trauma. When authorities finally confronted Michael, it was clear he was not the cold, calculated killer many had imagined. Instead, he was a young man broken by years of pain and confusion. Struggling with severe psychological distress, he confessed in a fractured, emotional way to what had happened on that terrible night. His story revealed a family torn apart, not just by violence, but by secrets and resentment that had been quietly building for years. Michael admitted that the disputes over the family inheritance had driven him to desperation. He felt overshadowed by his older brother Daniel and burdened by the expectations and pressures from his parents. The tension in the household, masked by years of silence, had finally erupted into the violence that destroyed them all. The symbol painted in blood was not a random act. It was Michael's way of trying to mislead the investigation, a desperate attempt to throw the police off his trail and confuse anyone trying to understand the horror he had unleashed. Though his confession brought clarity, it did little to ease the pain left behind. The community of Millfield struggled to come to terms with the fact that the killer was one of their own, a son and brother who had shattered a family from within. The neighbors who had once waved to the Hartmans with friendly smiles now looked back with sorrow and disbelief. The massacre, once a distant nightmare, became a painful reality that many would carry with them forever. The legal process that followed was complicated by Michael's mental health. He was deemed unfit to stand trial at first, leading to years of psychiatric treatment and evaluations. Yet the truth could no longer be hidden, and eventually, justice was served in a way that balanced accountability with compassion. Michael's case became a landmark in Ohio, highlighting the complex connections between mental illness, family dynamics, and violent crime. For the Hartman family, the tragedy was complete and absolute. The loss of 5 lives, each with their own story and struggles, left an unfillable void. The town erected a small memorial in their honor, a place where people could remember the family beyond the headlines and horror. It stood as a quiet reminder of the fragile nature of trust and the devastating consequences when that trust is broken. The worst family massacre in Ohio's history became a cautionary tale, an example of how appearances can deceive and how deeply hidden wounds can erupt with deadly force. For Millfield, the scars left by the Hartman tragedy would never fully heal. But through the pain, the town found strength in remembering, in seeking truth, and in ensuring that such a nightmare would never happen again. The story of the Hartmans remains a haunting chapter in Ohio's history, a chilling reminder that sometimes the darkest dangers come from those closest to us.